Of all the things in life, there should be nothing as preventable, as there is nothing on the face of it so unnatural as the death of a little child. Yet it is of all things in life the commonest and the only thing we make, as a community, the least effort to prevent. Charles Dickens. Until the second half of the 19th century, medicine in Europe was largely a general and in many respects a philosophical enterprise with little empirical basis. Prior to the development of germ theory and bacteriology, which were supported by advances in chemistry, laboratory techniques, and equipment, diseases were diagnosed and treated within the context of humorism, a pseudo-scientific theory inherited from the ancient Greeks and Romans, based on the concept of disease as a manifestation of an imbalance between four bodily fluids, or humors, or their individual corruption. These humors were linked to aspects of human personality, and their disturbance was variously ascribed to environmental factors, diet, and an assortment of activities. This medical system was particularly inadequate in the diagnosis and treatment of infants, who'd theoretically been shielded from the elements that were considered to be primary causes of disease. Until the late 19th century, rates of infant mortality in Europe hovered between 15 and 20%, more than twice the current level at which a flu outbreak in Western countries is declared an epidemic. In the words of one doctor, "There is reason to be pessimistic about childbirth, because so many infant lives seem to be little more in this existence than pieces in a game of checkers. Some win and some lose." In November of 1873, the 32-year-old Antonín Dvořák married Anna Chermakova, an avocational pianist and singer 13 years his junior. Although the composer had endured years of privation so grueling that he sometimes struggled to buy manuscript paper, his prospects were ascending. After resigning his position as a violist in the orchestra of the Provisional Theatre in Prague, he began to produce a series of works that established his reputation in the Czech capital as a serious composer, including a piano quintet, a patriotic cantata titled The Airs of the White Mountain, and a 3-act comic opera called King and the Charcoal Burner. In April of 1874, the young couple welcomed a son, Otakar. Later that year, Dvořák applied for the Austrian State Prize in Composition by submitting an enormous portfolio of works to the Ministry of Culture in Vienna. The jury, which included Johannes Brahms, was overwhelmed by Dvořák's creative fertility and the originality of his musical style, awarding him the prize and a generous stipend that he would also receive in 1876 and 77. Winning the state prize would become the pivotal moment in Dvořák's career. It brought his music to the attention of some of the most influential musical figures in the German-speaking world, which in addition to Brahms included the critic Eduard Hanslick and the publisher Fritz Simrock, all of whom would play a major role in the Czech composer's professional life. His music was now heard regularly outside of Prague, and for the first time as an adult, he was able to enjoy a modicum of financial security. This optimistic tableau was interrupted on August 21st, 1875, by the death of the Dvořák's second child, Josefa, after just 2 days of life. In spite of the all-too-common nature of this tragedy, it affected the composer deeply. She'd been named after Anna's older sister, Josefina, an actress at the Provisional Theatre with whom Dvořák had fallen in love years earlier, only to have his attentions gently turned away. Although he and Josefina established a warm friendship, it's likely that Dvořák's passion never faded entirely, and when she died in May of 1895, he took up his recently completed cello concerto and revised its ending, closing the work on an unexpectedly elegiac note. It appears that Josefa's death was the inspiration for Dvořák's first major sacred work, a setting of the 13th century Marian hymn Stabat Mater, or Mother Standing, a meditation on the grief of Mary as she stood at the foot of the cross watching her son die. A devoted Catholic, Dvořák began composing the piece in piano score on February 19, 1876, completing it less than 2 months later and then setting it aside, ostensibly to tend to other obligations. Given his demonstrated ability to work on more than one project at a time, his decision to leave such an important piece in a state of incompletion is notable. At a length of 90 minutes, Dvořák's Stabat Mater was the most extensive setting in the repertoire of a text that had already been set more than 400 times by previous composers. Laid out in a massive 10-movement structure, the work constituted the greatest achievement to that date by a Czech composer in the sphere of sacred music. Whether the experience of bringing the piece to provisional completion had been too emotionally taxing or sufficiently cathartic, he wouldn't return to it for well more than a year, and it's possible that the work would never have been finished if not for the intervention of further family tragedies. On August 13, 1877, the Dvořák's 11-month-old daughter, Lucena, accidentally drank a solution containing phosphorus and died. Less than a month later, their 3-year-old son, Otakar, succumbed to complications from smallpox. The grief-stricken, now childless couple was plunged into the deepest bereavement, and by early October, Dvořák had returned to his Stabat Mater, orchestrating the work and completing it on November 13th in Prague. In channeling his extreme personal sorrow into a larger exploration of human vulnerability, Dvořák achieved a form of musical expression that is at once characteristically natural and profoundly spiritual. The narrative arc of this work, which moves from imagery of death through states of intense existential anxiety before reaching a point of hopeful acceptance, is bound together by a deeply embedded sense of empathy. For Dvořák, the often difficult passage through this vale of tears could never lead him to turn away from his faith in the affirmative value of living.